Astro's new content layer promises to unlock a whole new level of data flexibility. In this video, I want to show you how you can take in data from an API endpoint, then transform it and shape it into the exact structure that you need in your project. Now, the real power here is that you can swap out your data layer very easily. So let's say you're using one CMS, suddenly you could swap out the data, transform it, and then use another CMS. It gives you a lot of power and flexibility. Now, there are several gotchas and things that I kind of ran into as I set this up. So let's walk through this step by step, starting with the local content collection and then moving over to an API endpoint using Astro's content layer. You ready? Let's jump in. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris and welcome to Coding in Public. Okay, so let's talk through some of the code we have already because right now we're simply using the default content collections as of right now in Astro. What we want to do is convert this to using the new content layer. So first of all, you'll see that I'm getting a content collection right here. It's got this shape right here, and I'm going to pass it to a card component that just displays it. I'm using Tailwind, but pretty basic stuff here. So let's actually look a little bit more at the config just to get a sense of what this collection looks like. You'll see it's a type of content. That means it's in the content folder and it's a markdown MDX file or a markdoc file. And I've got this shape to the data. That means if I jump back over this way, I should expect to see that right here. And I do. It's called food because that's what the collection is called. And it's got all this stuff right here. Okay, so cool. All that is displaying, all makes sense. Let's now use an API to do the same thing. So instead of using local files here, we're going to use an API. Now I happen to grab all the data here from an actual API. And that's right here, the meal DB. So what we can do is now hit one of these API endpoints and pull this in as our content collection instead of having to manually hard code all this stuff. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is come over here to my config. We're just going to add experimental here. And I want to make sure that I add the content layer. So content layer is true. And that way we can actually start to use this. Now, once you have the content layer, you don't actually need this type of content anymore for local markdown, MDX, JSON files, stuff like that inside of the content directory. Now you can actually now pull data from like a data folder or any other folder inside of SRC except for content and use what's called a loader. And they give you a glob function that's to grab several files of the same shape or a file function to grab a single file that could be like a CSV or a JSON or a bunch of other stuff. What we want to do though is write our own custom loader for an API endpoint. So I'm going to come over here and the first thing we're going to do is have an API food is what we'll call it. We'll just define a collection. And inside here, I want to have a loader. Now this loader is going to need to return some data. The first thing I want to do though, is go ahead and set this up as an async function so we can do asynchronous work inside of here. And at the very end, I need to make sure I return some kind of array. So in this case, we'll just leave it like that. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and have this API food be exported as well as one of these content collections. Okay, so what do we want to do inside of here? Well, if I jump over here, you'll notice that we've got a couple of options. I don't have a premium account, but I could do something like filter by area. So we could grab all this data right here and use that for instance. So the first thing I want to do is set up a response where we're just going to await a filter of all American food. Then of course I need to grab that response and convert it to data. Now if I were to look at this, let's just actually hit this one right here and open this up. You'll notice that it's just an array or an object with an array called meals. And this shows all the different meals. It does give me the name and it gives me a thumbnail for the meal, but the actual meal ID here is what I want because I want to grab that and grab the ingredients as well. So I can grab the ID and just to show you how we can do a little bit more complex stuff in here, I can then look it up by the ID. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, because we're going to be awaiting multiples of these, we'll need to wait all those promises to finish before we return the data. So that's a perfect use case for promise.all. So for sake of time, I'm going to paste this in and then talk through it. So you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm going to await all of these. I just name these any for now because we're going to shape the data later. And then you'll notice I'm hitting an API endpoint where I dynamically use the meal ID that I got from this right here, right? And for each of these meals, I then await their data and pick off the individual meal. Now, the reason I'm picking off the individual meals, if I open this back up, you'll notice that even for a single meal, I'm still getting this array. It's just that it should only have one item in it because I'm just getting that single meal. All right, so now that I've got all that stuff, I want to now return this down here. So instead of returning an empty array, we need to actually loop through this data and return it. Now, the one thing that every single piece of data needs from a content collection is an ID. So I can take my meal data and loop over each of those meals, and I make sure that I return an ID. Now, they all have this ID meal property. This comes from the API, and then I'll just spread in the rest of the content. So just like that, I should be able to come back over this way, and let's make sure that we duplicate this. We're going to say API foods. This will be API food. Now let's go ahead and console log this just so we can see what we're getting, and I'll open back up the project. So when I refresh, I should get all this stuff back. And notice I'm getting back the ID. I set that and I just spread in the rest of the data. So all the rest of the data comes in. So far that's working as we'd expect. We've fetched all those things, waited for each of them to finish, passed that on as our data layer. Now all this is done whenever you build your site. So it's not dynamic in that sense, but when you build, it'll fetch all that data and store it in cache. Now the real point I wanted to show is how you can transform that data using a schema. So let's go ahead and come back over this way, and underneath this loader, I should have another option. Just like with local content collections, I can propose a schema. Now, one thing to note here is that this is going to represent the API structure. So as you get back data from the API, that's what you're going to reflect here in your schema. So I'm going to have a z.object just to make sure we're clear what this should look like. Each of them should look just like this meal. So right over here, this is the structure, right? It should have an ID, and then it should have all of these properties. So the things I'm interested in are the title, the instructions, the thumbnail, and any tags it might have. Now I need to name these according to the data I'm getting back. So I know I'll have an ID, and I can actually do two things here. I can either pick off the ID I passed along, or I can actually use this meal ID right here. So let's go ahead and maybe just use that. This is going to be a z.string, it looks like. Next, I want the title of the meal. You'll notice it's called string meal like this. And once again, that's a string. The instructions are just the same, so let's use that. You can see it right here. And then notice that some of them are going to have tags. So the string tags, not all of them have this. So I want to make sure that it is optional. So we're going to say this is z.string, or it could also be z.null, because it may not exist at all. So we're using the API structure to pass back all the items we might want. I guess I also needed the thumbnail, didn't I? So yeah, so the string.thumb, let's use that as well. Here, Zod actually gives us a URL helper as well, so we could check it against that. Now let's come back over here, and I'm going to refresh my homepage and look down this way, and you'll notice that now the data is shaped exactly as we want. It's called meal ID, string meal, string instructions, all this kind of stuff. So it is called something different, but the shape of the data is actually correct. So in other words, by using the schema, you can limit what is returned in the content collection. So nothing else will be returned except for the things that I actually explicitly state here. Now you might say, oh, I know what I'll do. Since I've got the same structure, I can just simply pass this in like API foods. Now, think for a second, what do you think is going to happen? If I hit save, you'll notice I do get that number of items, but nothing is coming in. Now that's because if I come over here, it's expecting the data to be called certain things like thumbnail or title or whatever. But that's not the title of the properties that the API returns. So let's leave that there, and I want to come back this way and use a Zod transformation. And this is really where I think this content layer will be super powerful going forward, is you can very easily swap out your data layer. And as long as you can transform that data to take the shape and the property names that you want, you can very easily switch between them as you need to. So we can just transform the data like this. And this just comes baked in by Zod. So for each of these items, I want to reshape what they look like. So for the ID, I want this to be a number. Now, the reason I want it to be a number is because that's how I've set up my local content collection. So I want it to take on the same structure. So we could do like parse or whatever. Let's just do a number here. We'll say data.id meal. Now notice I'm getting IntelliSense because it knows the schema I'm getting back here. So let's rename all these. So I'll say title, and this is data.string meal. We'll do the same thing for the instructions and the thumbnail. And then finally for the tags, this could be a little bit different. Notice as I save it, it's brought all these things in. I don't actually have the tags showing up because some of them may not have tags. So what I want to do is check to see if there are tags. If it's not null, then I'm going to take the data.string tags like this, and we're just going to split because it should be a string with all the items just separated by commas. So I'm going to do that. Otherwise, we'll just say it's undefined. So notice just like that, now all my data structure is matching. And here I've now got tags coming in for this one. This one obviously didn't have one. Now I could also come up here. We have American. I could say like British or something like that and switch this out for something else. And notice that it pulls that in as well. So let's say you're using some kind of CMS. And as you get the data back, you're going to shape it the way you want it to be. If you want to switch out your CMS layer, that's now really easy to do. As long as you can transform it, you can take in the data as you receive it, transform it to the way that your entire site is expecting it, along with the names of the properties, and essentially just swap out your data layer. Now, a couple things just to remind you about before I let you go. Number one, as you get each of these items back, they must have an ID. This stands outside of the data itself and it identifies this particular item. Secondly, the schema itself is for the API structure. That is, the data you're actually receiving needs to be the name of the properties. Then it's smart enough that once you transform the data, it knows at this point that this is a string of arrays. So if this comes in as a string, that's what it needs to look like up here. If I want to transform it, I can transform it, and it's smart enough to infer all of those types. The schema limits what you get back from the API according to its own shape. Transform exposes the data layer and the structure you want. I hope that was a big help and demystified a lot that's available inside of content layers. Now, I will mention once again that content layers are built at runtime, so this is not dynamic. As you build, though, you can pull in this data layer and then structure it exactly as you want. And now you hopefully know how to do that. Well, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.